Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to the SaaS community channel where we talk about all things SaaS related. I'm extra excited. Today, I have with me Scott Woody, who is the CEO of Metronome, which is a company that may revolutionize usage-based billing. And this is such an important area and something that I've just seen happen again and again of companies who really try to go cloud, try to build SaaS business. So I'm extra excited to get to learn from all your experience and share it with all our viewers.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Scott, CTO here at Metronome. We do usage-based billing. We've been working on the problem for about 2 years, and our kind of core belief is that consumption-based or usage-based models, things, like if you're familiar with AWS, Twilio, Confluent, these businesses where the more you use of a service, the more you pay. We believe that's a dominant business model going forward for SaaS as a market, and we're building tools to make that as simple and easy as possible for you.
This is fantastic. So you work with so many different companies in various sizes who try to do usage-based billing. Can you talk a bit about at what stages of the company does it become relevant? When do I actually need to start thinking about it?
Yeah, I would say billing is one of those. It's like a very interesting problem space for companies because I think it can. When you're really small, like let's say you're like 5 people and an MVP, billing is one of those things that can either seem irrelevant. Like let's say you don't have a product that anyone is using, like you figuring out how to charge for it is not really, super important. Or it can seem that way, or it can seem really simple. Like, okay, I need to figure out how do I charge $9.99 a month every month? What could be so hard about that? And so billing in the early stages looks really straightforward and looks really simple. But what we found is that the complexities of billing really ratchet up quite quickly over time. And so we actually like to work, personally, and we kind of advise companies to think ahead. Like billing, I like to think about what does billing mean? Like billing as a act is like the act of generating invoices accurately. But for most software companies, billing actually has a much broader scope. So inside of a larger company, you need to accurately bill your customers, but you need to make sure that that data is integrated with whatever downstream finance systems you're using, like NetSuite. You need to make sure that your sales team is aware of, okay, well, we issued this bill and this customer didn't pay it, or, we issued this bill, like it's time for renewal. How much did they pay last month? I think that information needs to be accessible to all of your downstream systems. And so the way I actually like to think about billing is kind of the heart of the business side of your business, right? It is the truth about how much are you getting paid every month. And for usage-based billing, it is the thing that converts usage of your product into eventually revenue for your business. And so billing kind of takes on this expanded scope over time as your company grows and grows and scales. And I think it's one of the things about billing that's really interesting is that it kind of starts out looking relatively simple, starts out feeling kind of, like a thing that you could do in 2 weeks with 2 engineers, but the problems with it kind of grow really quickly, and happy to kind of talk about specifics if that's interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something that I didn't realize is that billing actually touches a lot of other functions in the company, right? It touches marketing because you have to align your pricing and your billing in some way. It touches things like customer retention and renewal because you will see that usage is dropping off and you can predict the churn maybe. How do most companies handle all that? I mean, do they do everything in the billing app? Is it like?
Yeah, I would say for companies on a usage-based model, in particular, I would say there really isn't a great product on the market. So what they end up doing is they end up staffing it kind of internally. And there's like usually an internal team called a billing team, payments team sometimes. And that team is kind of responsible for making sure, first and foremost, that like you're accurately billing your customer set. And then secondarily, doing all the kind of like integrations out to those other business functions. And, I worked at Dropbox before I started this company, and at Dropbox, one of the teams I worked on for a brief period was an internal tools team. And to me, I think of billing as like this, like it's like the ultimate internal tooling team, because you are building something that operates at like production scale, but like who in the business isn't your customer? Sales cares about this information. As you said, like customer support cares a lot about it. Finance obviously cares about it. Engineering and product have to interface and like supply you information in order to accurately bill and know when a customer signed up or didn't, churned. And so it really is a system that lives at the heart of all of your business, your teams. And that's, I think, why a lot of people end up staffing a billing team. But if you've ever worked as an internal tooling team, I think sometimes staffing for that team can be hard to find. Like the business isn't always like super jazzed about, giving resources to that part of the org. I think they should, but it's understandable why they don't. And then secondarily, especially for billing, it's not like most internal tools where you have like one stakeholder. Your stakeholder is whatever, recruiting, or your stakeholder is engineering or whatever. Your stakeholder is like everyone in the business, at least everyone on the business side of the house. And so like balancing finances needs versus sales needs versus, it's actually a really, really thorny problem for those teams. And when we talk to them, I actually have a lot of like, the people who do that, I think are like my personal heroes, because a lot of it is really hard for them to, do that prioritization mechanism exercise, right? It's like ultimately like, how do you prioritize sales versus finance? Like it's like, I don't envy any PM who has to kind of sit there, eng manager who has to sit there and make those priority decisions, because no matter what you do, you're going to make someone unhappy in that process. And I think the art of a great billing team is that you are accurately like kind of, whack-a-moling the problems as they come up.
So you mentioned something interesting, that it's actually an interesting engineering problem right there. Yeah. And you have to hire for a team with a very specific function. Is there like an engineering specialization around billing? Like just like I would go and hire a data engineer, I can go and hire a billing engineer, is it not a thing yet? Who would I hire? What would I even write in the job description?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a specialization of people who work in, in billing, Amazon's, I don't know the exact team size number, but like AWS's billing team I've heard is in the hundreds, if not thousands of people. So it's definitely like, there's like a lot of people who are, kind of serial billing engineers. I think the skill sets that you're looking for is like, it really is a pretty unique person, because you need to be motivated by the same things that motivate an internal tooling engineer, right? So, what I typically find that profile looks like is like someone who's extremely impact focused, where impact is defined as impact to your coworkers. But it is a super high volume production infrastructure problem, like at least the billing version of this problem is. I've heard accounts, again, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but that AWS's internal essentially billing service is one of the highest, if not the highest track service internally, and a trafficked service. And so you actually are talking about one of the high, especially for a usage-based business, one of the, most trafficked and also most sensitive systems internally, right? Like if you can't accurately bill your customers and you have hundreds of thousands of customers or millions of customers, that's a huge problem for the business. And so it's like you have to find this unique unicorn of someone who's like doesn't want to be, they don't want their name associated with whatever mainline product you are, because you're doing the billing for that product, but you also need to be capable of thinking through the high scale distributed systems problems that come with billing. And so, it's like a pretty unique person who's motivated by that. But those people who are honestly, they're great. They're like some of the they're some of the best people to work with as an engineer, because you're just like, this person is like pathologically dedicated toward all the minutia of billing and making sure that every edge case is handled. I think another thing that I think really defines great billing engineers is like the edge case thinking, and all of the like is like ratchet up 1,000%. Like with billing, you really can't there's like a lot of undefined cases and edge cases in how the system could or should work, and you really need someone who's capable and willing to kind of dive into all the minutia. It's a very precise thing, but it's a very precise, like really kind of detail oriented thinking that needs to be done with building out billing services. And it's quite fun. It's kind of like a Swiss walk or something. But,
you mentioned several times how important accuracy is. And I wanted to dive a tiny bit into that, because I'm probably naive, but worst case scenario, you send customer the wrong bill, you say sorry, you complain, you say sorry, you correct it. It's all good. Like, why do you think it's so critical to focus on like this extreme accuracy, like almost rocket science level of accuracy?
Yeah, there's a couple things that are interesting to think about here. The first is like, I think customers love to read invoices and bills with a fine-tuned comb. It kind of really depends on who your customer is. Like some customers like me, if you send me a bill, I will just pay it. I don't even, I'm like pretty lazy, etc. But like, most finance people are the opposite, right? They'll read every single line item. And the way I like to think about it is like, cell phone bills, like back in the day in the like 2000s, when you'd get like an envelope of your cell phone bill, you'd get like a one line item that says like you owe $49 or whatever it is. And then they would send you like this ream of paper with every single call record and every single text record. And I always thought that was insane. I'm like, I don't care about this detail, but it turns out that like financial people, accountants, accounts payable people, there's a lot of them who really do care about every single penny that gets spent inside of a business. And so something like billing, especially in a high volume situation like a usage-based billing, they're going to look through that with a fine-tooth comb. In fact, they're paid, their entire job is to read with scrutiny every single one of these things. And so that's why accuracy, one reason to care about accuracy is because if you're inaccurate, it'll get detected. And then, the downside of that is they're going to dispute it. And that means that revenue or that money that you thought you were going to collect, gets delayed by 6 months, like 3 weeks. Is like, back and forth. I don't think I owe you this. I think I owe you this. And it's like, it's a bad customer experience, but also like it meaningfully does extend the kind of timeline for you to be able to recognize and receive money, which for a cash flow intensive business, which, all public companies are at some level, like it becomes really, really important. And also you just don't want the operational headache of kind of going back and forth with a customer, like 10 cycles to like get to like, this is the true bill. So you really need to be accurate out of the gates. The other reason, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned people going over the bill with its fine-tooth comb, and you also mentioned how sophisticated AWS billing is. Now, I think it's fairly well known in the industry that you actually need to hire specialists to make sense of the AWS bill. Are there any best practices, like if I do usage-based billing for my own customers, how to avoid, somewhere down the line having a Confluent Cloud pricing specialist out there?
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think this is where my personal bias as the founder of Metronome comes in. But like, I think, as a customer of a service like AWS, I look at the like invoice amount as the first step in telling me what I owe you. And then I think of it like a product experience. Like, what would the good product experience be in your like internal dashboards or in addition to an invoice that would help me as a customer gain confidence that this bill is the right one? So, one of the things that we do with our clients is we supply them, every time we write an invoice, we also supply them a bunch of what I call like adjunct data or metadata about the invoice that basically gives them their equivalent of those call data records to their customers. And they actually host those on their internal dashboards so that clients can kind of download and look at that information directly. I think the best of our customers, actually what they end up doing is they build a little bit of a product experience in the dashboard that kind of elaborates the invoice a little bit. Maybe what it does is it says, let's say you're a cloud database company and you have like 15, or a cloud data warehouse company like Snowflake, and you have like any one of your customers has like 15 data warehouses that are running. How do you, maybe what you could do is break down the invoice by each of those individual data warehouses so that you could say, actually, data warehouse ABC owned by team XYZ, spent $12 this month, and this other one spent $10,000, to kind of give them a little bit more granular information to be able to consume it. And really, like, what I would actually just say is have a designer spend like 10 minutes like thinking about how would I explain this invoice or this bill to the customer, and design a small, it doesn't have to be a major thing, but like a small product experience around that. Like I think AWS does the opposite. They just drown you in data, right? Why do they do that? They do that in some sense so that you can, it's like their kind of MO on everything, but they do that so that you have all the information, but they spend no time trying to make it understandable or useful. And that's why entire companies are spun up to like understand my AWS bill. So I would say like, I think it's a slightly tricky product design problem, but what I actually find with most companies is they just don't put in the time or effort to do anything there. They kind of assume that the invoice is the be all end all, and they don't do the next step of work.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, I don't know if Metronome and one of your product customers actually partner on like a public user study. Like it gave all those different invoices to different users and try to see if they make any sense. That could be industry changing.
Yeah, I think, yes, we are slowly discovering what we think the great, essentially billing experience looks like here. And I think it starts with providing a lot of rich information. And then it kind of, I think one of the key insights I'll kind of leave your audience with is that at the end of every month, you generate a bill or an invoice. There's really at least two customers of that object. The first is the accounts payable team, right? Who is paying the bill. They want to be able to like go see how much do I owe, who do I owe it to, when is it due? The secondary audience is whoever the user of that invoice is. So like if you're an engineering manager, you're probably getting that invoice and you're forwarding it on to accounts payable. That person, that engineering manager in that scenario, they're the one who can prove, who can dispute or not dispute the bill, right? They're the one who looks at it and says, okay, this looks wrong. And so there's really two audiences there. And an invoice, this kind of like flat, like you owe $5,000 or whatever, it's inappropriate for that second audience. Like an invoice is optimized for accounts payable, but in a usage-based world, there's all this rich metadata who has a completely separate target. Like finance can't use that information for anything, but the engineering manager can. And so how do you, in some sense, you got to think of the product. There's like the invoice has two customers behind it, at least. And you got to design for both of them. And that's why we supply this adjunct data, because the adjunct data is targeted at the more technical user. And then the invoice is targeted at accounts payable, who just needs to know how much do I owe, who do I owe, when. And it's like, it's like yeah.
Yeah, I think you highlighted one of the things that can be the most painful part in the receiving end of the billing experience, which is one of the nightmare of, I think, every modern engineering manager is at the end of the month, you get a ridiculously high bill. And then you discover that 3 weeks ago, someone ran a large load test and forgot it all over the weekend. And has happened before. Is there industry best practices on like when people design a billing system, how to make sure that their customers will not have a sticker shock?
Yeah, I think what you've highlighted is actually one of the key things that we think differentiates a kind of a consumption-based business model. It's like the good thing about a consumption-based business model is that your customers can get infinite value from it, right? Like if you and they can, and then correspondingly spend as much money as you allow them to spend, which is great. They can spin up and spin down instances. If I wanted to, I could go spend $1 million on AWS tomorrow. That's awesome because it like really lowers the friction of using your product. The downside, though, is exactly what you highlighted, is you can actually have errant things where maybe an intern signs on and like basically like spins up a very expensive AWS cluster and ends up costing you $10,000 because they forgot to turn it off. So what we see with the most sophisticated players in this space is really they invest in essentially like what I think of as like real-time or continuous billing. So basically like that at any point your customers can look in, sign into their dashboard and say like, oh, how much money have I spent this month? So that like they don't find out that the intern spun something up at the end of the month. They could sign into the dashboard and kind of go look at it. Next layer up obviously is putting around notifications or spending alerts around that stuff. So giving that end customer tooling to be able to say, if spend goes above whatever it was last month, or 10% above what it was last month, send me an email immediately or a notification immediately so I can go and investigate. And so I think this is a nascent thing. Like the way we've built Metronome is to support this kind of use case, which is to say, actually, continuous spend is amazingly efficient, but also has a lot of these like secret downsides. And you need to build kind of notification tooling and alerting tooling around it to be able to deliver the best customer experience there. We've heard horror stories of companies where like a small startup that had raised no capital signs into some, big public company who shall not be named and end up spending $100,000 in a month when they have $0 in the bank. And they, in that case, what ends up happening, like, the company either goes bankrupt or the big player kind of refunds $100,000. Either way, someone is out of money. And I think that's a really bad scenario. And we like to build tooling that can kind of forestall those things. And I think it's just about, it's like, for me, usage-based is continuous, which means you need to think about these problems continuously. It's not like a thing that you only think about once a month. It's a thing that you want to be thinking about constantly, and your customers are going to be thinking about constantly. And you need to give them tools to detect error cases, basically.
Yeah, it's almost like observability tools. Do you find yourself actually kind of rewriting a lot of state of the art from another field?
I would say we end up borrowing very heavily, both on the technology and the product side, from observability tooling. When we started Metronome, that was basic. The basic analogy was like observability tool. Like it's basically like billing, but munged with observability. And so, we use Kafka behind the scenes to process all events in real time. We are, have the facilities for doing alerting, have this facilities for being able to detect, detect an alert, like send a webhook when a pattern, when some credit threshold gets hit. So we find ourselves borrowing very heavily. And honestly, I think a lot of the work that the observability, a lot of work in observability at high scale over the past 10 years kind of created the technology that enables a company like Metronome to exist. And so, I would say it's less that we're cloning what they're doing. It's more like they're creating tools that we can then use off the shelf to do our little thing, which is billing.
I like that a lot. I mean, it's nowadays you put it that way, it's exactly the same thing. You collect a lot of metrics and you generate a lot of insights based on them. Were you ever tempted to use those metrics that you use for billing and provide additional value on top of them? I mean,
you mean like kind of like growth related things around?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have, as you said, like all the data that is critical about the growth of the business.
Yeah. I think, our stance here is that we want to collect that information and then make it available to you. And so, I think in the future, we may decide to do things like, okay, like how do we, how do we help surface, like, maybe your business model should look like this, based on this usage patterns, etc. Right now, our kind of core thing is, let's collect the data, let's make it available, let's process it continuously, and then let's give you APIs, let's give you tooling to be able to extract the insights that you want. But and really the reason for that was, we wanted to establish like a true source of truth, like that you could bill on. The way I like to think about it is, part of the reason why a lot of, I think, usage-based businesses don't bill out of the data warehouse is that fundamentally they haven't done the work to make sure that the data flowing into the data warehouse is billing quality in my thinking. And so when you work with Metronome, you kind of go through that act of, we work with you to make sure that the data is high enough quality that you could bill on it. And then we do the processing continuously in real time. And then we let you access it however you want. And we're kind of like learning from our customers. We're seeing where they want to take this stuff. We're in the early innings right now, so I could imagine that we do some interesting things down the line. But our goal right now is just to be that source of truth that you trust to bill on every month for your customers.
Yeah, I can totally see why. Because usually when people think about data warehouse, accuracy is not the top of mind at all.
Right.
And there's like a long history, like that people think, if we have the transaction database, that's the one that has to be accurate, the ones that the business actually runs on. And then there is data warehouse, it's for reporting. It has to be eventually accurate, but it doesn't actually have to be all that accurate at any point in time. So, yeah, and I think actually even surfacing two engineers who do the data reporting, that the data is used in certain ways, probably helps a lot. Do you see companies basically reimagine a bunch of their internal data pipelines as a result of maybe... Actually, did you ever work with a company who transitioned into usage-based model from a more traditional subscription model? Because it seems like they have to maybe rewrite the entire company.
Yeah, yes, that actually is our most common customer, is one who is kind of in a traditional subscription business model, and they're launching a new product that's maybe like a cloud product that kind of is elastic in terms of spend. And so they're doing usage-based for the first time, but they already have an established business processes for collecting revenue for these kind of subscriptions. So a lot of our clients are in that position. And I think at the end of the day, it really is a reworking of almost every aspect of how the business works. And so, what you see is that, the way that you think about sales comp has to change drastically. Like, in a world where a salesperson is commissioned on the initial deal size, doesn't make any sense for a usage-based deal, right? Where the initial deal size is zero because there's no spend. At the end of the first month, there's hopefully some usage and hopefully some money that's flowing in. And so sales compensation has to be reworked. Basically every single process is totally different between the two. And actually we see this happening all the time, and it's a really fascinating space. I think it's like very dovetailed with like are you familiar with the product-led growth?
Yeah. So
it's very of akin with that, where you're trying to take these two business models and kind of make that, like, it's like this subscription model and this newer model of usage-based, and trying to push them together. I think that causes a lot of heartache for the teams who are responsible for making sure that is happening.
This is super interesting. So I always thought of product-led growth as being kind of, or maybe orthogonal to how I do billing. But it sounds like you feel like there is a natural affinity between consumption-based and product-led growth.
Yes, that's exactly the way I think about it, is that I think if you think about a product-led growth motion, you're trying to get customers in the door and you're trying to get them exposed to your product and kind of see the value of your product. And then as they use the product more, they basically increase in their monetization potential. And so it's really this idea that the product kind of helps ladder them up from an account that's maybe spending nothing to something that's like one of your major accounts where you have a dedicated sales rep. And and it's not to say that you have to have a consumption-based model in order to make PLG work, but that consumption is a very, very natural fit for that model, because you're essentially like every step along that journey of I'm not using the product at all to I'm using it a little bit to I'm using it a lot. If you can properly manipulate your business model into a consumption-based model, you kind of can capture, deliver continuous value and capture on your side continuous amounts of money. And I think you've aligned the two incentives of your customer. I want to get more value from the product, and then I want to pay more correspondingly for it. And so consumption to me is really or consumption-based business models are just a natural fit for a lot of PLG, especially in like infrastructure SaaS. And that's why you see a huge, you were like Confluent Cloud is a great example of the kind of thing where you really want to see, like, if you can design a business model that works hand in glove with this, then you kind of enable the PLG motion without needing to kind of unduly contort yourself to make the business model work.
Yeah, I can totally see like just aligning all the incentives externally and internally would work really well. If we go back to the engineering concerns, because we kind of dropped off after we talked about the big accuracy problem, and we trend off to talk about our business problems. What do engineers need to do in order to really have this high accuracy? I think it's kind of funny to think about it, but actually most of our problems don't require very, very high degree of accuracy.
Right. Yes. I think the first thing that we find, and this happens with every one of our customers that we work with and people we see, is kind of an investment into the telemetry phase. It's kind of like, again, to use the observability tooling, right? You can only like fix what you can measure. And so I think investing a lot in the kind of what in usage-based world is called metering, but basically the ability to accurately generate the information that can then be turned into an invoice at the end of the month. I think that like heavy investment in telemetry and logging, depending on the type of product that you're selling, is super important there. Obviously doing that, if you're a company at scale, is like a really hard data management problem. And, there's a lot of things, like just building that system is really tough, and making sure that every single edge case of, a customer provisions this instance and then deprovisions it instantaneously. And, and did it actually spin up or not? Did the signal get to Amazon or not? And like handling all the edge cases there. It's just like depending on the type of product that you're building, like it's a really, really hard problem, and one that I think requires a lot of investment from your engineering teams. That's one. I think another is like managing that data at scale. Like I said, I think like customers of these types of models have a expectation that at any moment I could sign into my dashboard and see like at least an approximation of how much I owe. So, the kind of age-old way to do billing at a place like the older generation of companies might be at the end of every month, you run like a SQL query to kind of go, okay, cool. Like how many users are in the user table, and voila. For a company like AWS, obviously that's actually not like, you're probably not storing like instant spin up, spin down logs in a relational database. That's probably not how you're storing this information, at least not until you've invested into it properly. And so there's where do you store this information? It's actually a ton of information. How do you process it in real time, or as close to real time as possible? Is it like a daily batch sufficient? Is hourly batch sufficient? How do those batch processes scale as your customer base scales? And so what you'll hear is these horror stories of like the bill run for a company that is 10 people big takes 3 seconds, and then 12 months later it takes 3 hours, and then 12 months later it takes 3 days, and at some point it's like it doesn't ever complete. And it's one of these things where the scaling factor of all of these systems, in a success case for your business, actually these problems kind of get pathological very fast. And then step into a world where you have multiple product lines owned by multiple different business stakeholders, and different engineering teams are responsible for different, like the telemetry of their service. And they need to know that, that the logging has to be, billing quality. And suddenly these engineering problems just kind of spiral out, and they kind of morph into more of like what I think of as kind of internal tooling type of problems, internal business process type of problems. And then, it's like it's hard enough to get every feature into every new product line, but making sure that like accurate telemetry as part of that is not necessarily like top of the list for a lot of engineering teams. And it's like a action at a distance problem, because like your billing team can't be the one who is adding telemetry to every product that you do. That's just not possible. And so convincing those other stakeholders to kind of do that is, becomes a whole people management problem too. So it's kind of like, it's like a very nested, interesting set of problems that kind of come with it.
Yeah, it's hilarious for me because like a lot of it is like not new billing problems. Like I spent a lot of my career building data warehouses. The report that never gets completed is kind of the bread and butter of everyone who tries to scale a data warehouse. A lot of those problems, like how good are your pipelines? Is anything leaky? Like this is just so familiar. Something that kind of I was wondering, because it's a set of familiar problems, and also usage-based billing itself is not super new. Like I'm thinking like in ad tech, like the pay-per-click model, it was there for like almost 2 decades. How come we're all still building it ourselves? Essentially, you're now starting a company, but it's such a new space.
That's a great question. I think so. My answer to this is that, like usage-based in some ways is like one of the oldest business models. Like if you think about electricity companies, those are all usage-based. Telecom, also usage-based. Early internet companies, I think, like AWS has been around for, decades at this point. So it's not like it's an unknown business model, but I think the timing thing that has happened is really like, I think one, business models kind of go through these like decadal shifts where in like the 90s, you're buying software, you're like essentially buying hardware and software packaged together. And then like, so Salesforce comes around and you're not buying software, you're buying access to software, you're buying like a seat model. And so seat model kind of ascends in the 2000s and then it continues into the like 2010s. What we've seen is just like a huge, and so part of the, obviously like AWS has been around for a long time and there's been a number of usage-based businesses. My argument would be that like up until recently, we just haven't seen the scale of companies to support a market for usage-based businesses. And even like we started Metronome 2 years ago. When we started it, like all the VCs told us, okay, cool, but like no one's on a usage-based model. And then, think about the last year, Confluent IPO, Snowflake IPO, Databricks is, killing it in all the ways that they're killing it. And the number of like inbound leads to us has like gone up by huge orders of magnitude. And I think what has happened is just that some bit flipped in the valley where everyone's like, oh, actually these usage-based or consumption-based models have a lot of really nice properties about them. They, value scales with pay. So the more value I get, the more I pay. That's like an incredible thing. I like to argue that like usage-based models make a lot of sense to engineers, right? Like as an engineer, I'm like, I don't want to pay for a seat that I'm not going to use. I want to pay for the value that I'm getting from it. And you see this huge surge in like infrastructure SaaS companies, like basically companies that are selling to engineers. And it's just a business model that makes a lot of sense for it. And then you also see the rise of things like, very data processing heavy products, like ML products are, essentially the cost basis for an ML product is like, how much data do I have to crunch in order to deliver the insight to you? And that essentially, like my underlying costs are AWS, GCP, or Azure. And so I'm going to have to find a business model that kind of aligns my costs to what you pay me. And so it's kind of this natural fit that I think as the cloud honestly has kind of taken hold, you're just seeing like a huge surge in it. And that, for us, that was the market opportunity that we saw that made us like, okay, cool, we got to go start this company now, because we think that this is going to happen. And I would say over the past 2 years, it really, like, the number of companies thinking about usage or consumption-based business models has just gone through the roof.
Yes. Your timing is kind of amazing, I have to say, because very early in the life of Confluent, we agreed with you. Basically, we saw that creating this very nice post curves that aligned with the throughput, the number of messages you sent to Kafka, we thought it would be really cool. But back then, we mostly sold on-prem, and customers did not even know how to have this conversation. They're like, tell me how many cores I need and how much do you charge per core. This is what I care about. So I have surprised that there was this mindset industry shift that you can now deal in ways that make sense, that it made sense to engineers a decade ago, but we couldn't explain it to anyone who actually signs the checks.
Or they weren't I think this is like, in product-led growth, the engineer is the buyer, right? And so you suddenly reward having a business model that makes sense to the buyer, like the engineer. Whereas in like the case where you're doing an enterprise sale, the buyer is ultimately like a finance person, and like an engineer is a consultant on that buy, of course, and they make the ultimate decision probably. But they're, it's like it's like, I think PLG actually helps also explain the timing, where it's like the acceleration has really kind of that's just kind of like thrown everything else into overdrive.
So we're almost at time, and I got gazillion great insights from you.
Cool.
I had one, maybe a bit off-topic question, but I'm very curious. In your journey to really build a company in this challenging and exciting space, did you have a role model, an inspiration in mind, someone that kind of admired and looked that, yes, I'm trying to do this?
You like a entrepreneurial inspiration, or like
maybe something else? Surprise me.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. I think I think about it in a couple ways. So like, I think for our company, when we were thinking about it, what we wanted to do was we want to look at the like luminaries in the field who are like really doing usage-based businesses well, and kind of translate what they're doing to our clients or our customers. So we looked at companies like AWS and Snowflake, and and Databricks and Confluent and all of these companies. We kind of like look at what are they doing really well, and kind of like pull them together as a way to like inform, what does great look like in this market. And so I hold all of those companies in like extremely high regard, especially like for how they've like pushed forward the kind of usage-based billing. I think personally, the types of people that I tend to admire are, I'm an entrepreneur. I think one of the things that I really like, and the thing that I appreciate most about entrepreneurs, is people who are kind of able to repeatedly succeed. So like, they don't just do it once, they succeed multiple times, because it means that they probably understand something that the rest of us don't. And as someone who's tried to start companies before and failed, like, I really appreciate like the people who are able to do it multiple times. And I, in particular, I think there's like, Elon Musk is like a very trite answer. I think like someone like him, someone who's able to do that several times. And then honestly, I just admire a lot of these companies that are I admire the business models of companies like Salesforce and Atlassian and Intuit, these companies that have made a business of acquiring and bringing in multiple business lines in order, like multiple products over long periods of time. And there's a reason why these companies are still around after 20 plus years of being in business. And I think as an entrepreneur, my goal is to build an enduring long-term business. And I study what those companies have done, because they didn't just succeed once. They succeeded once, and then they did it again and again and again. And I think that to me is like the mark of a truly, like, that's what I admire. I admire like the hard work, the repeated success. And that's kind of really what I've been, when I think about who I admire, my role models, those are the types of people that I look at.
Yeah. This ended up being very inspiring. So yeah, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. I learned so much in this conversation, and I'm sure all our listeners did as well. And this was just super valuable.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate it. I hope this was very fun for me, and I Hope your audience got to learn something. And of course, if they have any questions, they should send me an email.
Thank you so much. I will make sure your email is attached to the presentation.
Cool.
So they actually can.